Picture the England you know from school. Portraits of Henry VIII, massive, immovable, draped in fur and gold brocade. The king who broke with Rome. The king who built the Church of England.
The king whose court was the most sophisticated in Europe, filled with theologians, humanists, musicians, and scholars. A civilization constructing the architecture of modern governance. Codified law, parliamentary authority. The slow, serious business of building a nation on precedent and principle.
Now, forget that picture entirely, because in 1531, in the reign of that same Henry VIII, in that same sophisticated civilization, a man named Richard Roose was lowered into a cauldron of boiling water in front of a public crowd in Smithfield, London, and cooked alive. Not in the darkness of a dungeon, not as an unofficial atrocity that the crown later disavowed. In public, by law, with parliamentary authorization, with a specific act of parliament passed for exactly this purpose.
And the thing that should permanently change how you think about Tudor England is not the execution itself. It is what the execution reveals about the machinery of power beneath the gilded surface. Here is what the portrait does not show you.
Here is what the pageantry was designed to conceal. The story begins not with a king, but with a kitchen. The year is 1531.
Bishop John Fisher of Rochester is one of the most powerful men in England, a theologian of international reputation and advisor to the crown, and one of the few people in the kingdom willing to publicly oppose Henry VIII's plan to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon.
Fisher is therefore precisely the kind of man Henry VIII wants gone, not necessarily dead, not yet, but weakened, discredited, manageable.
On February 18, 1531, a large pot of gruel is prepared in Bishop Fisher's household kitchen. The gruel is distributed to Fisher's household staff and to a group of poor people who regularly receive alms from Fisher's residence. 16 people eat from the pot. Several become violently ill. 2 of them die. Bishop Fisher himself does not eat the gruel that day. He survives. The cook responsible for preparing the pot is a man named Richard Roose. He is arrested almost immediately. Think about what this means structurally before we go any further.
An assassination attempt against one of Henry VIII's most prominent opponents has apparently just been thwarted. The king's political enemy has survived. 2 innocent people are dead.
And in custody is a low-level kitchen worker who prepared the contaminated food. In any legal system built on the principles of justice it claims to represent, what follows is an investigation. Motive, opportunity, evidence. Who wanted Fisher dead? Who had access to the kitchen? Who gave instructions to Roose, if anyone did? None of that happened. What happened instead is one of the most revealing legislative acts in English history. Within weeks of the poisoning, Henry VIII personally convened Parliament and proposed a new law. The Act of Poisoning 1531. Under this act, poisoning was reclassified not merely as murder, which it already was, punishable by hanging, but as a special category of crime called petty treason. Petty treason in English law meant a crime committed against someone in a position of authority over you. A servant killing a master, a wife killing a husband. These crimes were considered worse than ordinary murder because they represented a violation of the natural hierarchical order, the very fabric of social structure. But here is what makes the 1531 Act extraordinary. Petty treason carried a specific punishment that differed from ordinary murder precisely in its theatrical brutality. Not hanging, not beheading, boiling alive. The act was passed, and under its provisions, Richard Roose became the first person in English history to be executed by boiling. If you want to understand what Tudor governance actually was, beneath the scholarship, beneath the pageantry, beneath the architecture of law, you have to sit with what just happened here. A king who wanted a political opponent eliminated. An assassination attempt that failed. 2 dead bystanders. And instead of a murder investigation, a new law designed specifically to boil the most convenient available suspect alive. Here is what no textbook will tell you about that legislative process. The reclassification of poisoning as petty treason was not a response to a legal gap that needed filling.
Poisoning was already a capital crime. Richard Roose was already facing a death sentence. The reclassification served exactly one purpose. It changed the method of execution.
Hanging was quick. Beheading, reserved for nobility, was considered an honorable death, a clean severance.
The punishments that carried maximum terror, maximum suffering, maximum theater were the punishments attached to petty treason and high treason. Burning, drawing and quartering, boiling. Henry VIII did not pass a law because justice required it. He passed a law because he wanted what followed to be as long and as public and as agonizing as possible.
He wanted a performance, and he wanted it to carry a message that everyone in England could decode. Richard Roose, whether guilty of conspiring to poison Fisher or simply of catastrophic incompetence in the kitchen, was transformed from a criminal into a symbol.
The execution took place at Smithfield, London's traditional site of public execution and punishment. The method was exactly what the act prescribed. A large iron cauldron was prepared over an open fire. The water was brought to a boil.
Roose was lowered into it. He was not lowered all at once. Historical accounts of boiling executions in this period describe a process of incremental immersion. The condemned man lowered and raised repeatedly. The process extended deliberately to maximize the duration of consciousness and suffering. Think about the crowd. Smithfield could accommodate thousands of witnesses, and the witnesses at a Tudor public execution were not passive observers. They were participants in a ritual of power. They were expected to react, to engage, to carry the spectacle home with them into their kitchens, their conversations, and their dreams. The crowd at Roose's execution watched a man being cooked alive over the course of somewhere between 15 minutes and 2 hours, depending on which account you read. They smelled what boiling human flesh smells like, an odor that survivors of industrial accidents describe as somewhere between cooking pork and burning hair, simultaneously familiar and absolutely wrong. A smell that the brain cannot properly process because it references something it has been trained not to recognize as food. They heard the sounds that accompany that process. They watched until it was over. Then they went home. The message they carried with them was precisely the message Henry VIII had constructed the entire apparatus to deliver.
Your body belongs to the crown. Your pain belongs to the crown. Your death belongs to the crown. And the crown will spend it in whatever denomination it chooses.
Now, if you have ever suspected that the version of history taught in schools is a carefully edited version that protects the powerful, you are right. Subscribe and turn on notifications because we are just getting started on what textbooks will never show you. Let us go deeper into the biological reality of what the crowd actually witnessed. The medical precision here is important, and mainstream history never touches it. The human body, boiled alive, does not simply die. It undergoes a staged process of destruction that takes far longer than most people assume, and each stage produces its own sensory evidence for the watching crowd. The first effect of immersion in near boiling water is the immediate and catastrophic destruction of the nerve endings in the skin. This sounds like it might reduce pain. It does not. The nerve damage is not complete in the early stages, and the signals the surviving nerves transmit are of a kind the brain is not equipped to process. Not the sharp, localized pain of a cut or a burn from a flame, but a total body signal that the nervous system has no prior experience with and no framework for managing. The skin begins to separate from the underlying tissue almost immediately. The proteins in the outer layers of skin denature at temperatures that the body would still, technically, be alive to experience. Within the first few minutes, the skin takes on the appearance of what cooks in Tudor kitchens would have recognized immediately, the skin of a bird dropped in scalding water to loosen the feathers. This is not a metaphor. This is exactly what it looks like. The people watching from the crowd at Smithfield, many of whom had spent their lives in kitchens, on farms, preparing animals for consumption, would have recognized the visual evidence of what was happening to Richard Roose's body with a specificity that modern viewers would not have. They knew what they were watching. They knew what the process was, and they were watching it happen to a man. The internal organs fail in sequence. The core temperature rises more slowly than the extremities, which means the process of dying takes place unevenly,
with different systems failing at different rates.
The brain, protected by the skull and somewhat insulated by surrounding tissue, may retain some level of function well into the process of external destruction. The accounts that describe a process of raising and lowering, allowing the condemned partial cooling before re-immersion, were not accidents of method.
They were a deliberate technique. The purpose was to extend the period of consciousness, to ensure the performance lasted long enough to be maximally educational.
Here is the thing that should stay with you when you consider what Tudor England thought of itself. Henry VIII in 1531 was not a medieval king in a dark age. He was a Renaissance monarch who corresponded with Erasmus.
His court produced some of the finest humanist scholarship in Europe. His legal system was, by contemporary standards, sophisticated. He employed judges who debated the philosophy of just governance. And he used that sophisticated machinery to cook a kitchen worker alive in public because a political inconvenience had occurred in that kitchen worker's vicinity.
Roose may have been guilty. He may have introduced some substance into the gruel. Contemporary accounts suggest he claimed it was a joke, a purgative intended only to make the household sick, not to kill.
He may have been the instrument of someone with a direct motive to harm Fisher, someone whose name never appeared in any official record, because that was precisely how Tudor power protected itself. The investigation that would have established which of these possibilities was true was never seriously conducted, because Richard Roose was not, in any meaningful sense, on trial for a crime. He was on trial for the crime of being available. Henry VIII needed the poisoning to be resolved in a way that sent a message, removed an embarrassing loose end, and simultaneously created a new legal instrument of terror that could be deployed against any future threat. The act of poisoning, 1531, accomplished all three objectives simultaneously. Roose's guilt or innocence was structurally irrelevant to any of them. Think about the complicit architecture around this event. The judges who advised the drafting of the act, the parliamentarians who voted for it, the sheriffs who carried out the sentence, the priests who attended the execution. Not one of them stood up and pointed out that the man being boiled alive had not received anything resembling a fair investigation into his actual culpability. Not because they were uniquely monstrous, because the social cost of pointing this out in a court built around the absolute will of Henry VIII was obviously fatal. The men in Henry VIII's court were intelligent enough to recognize a trap when they saw one, and wise enough not to put their foot in it. The complicit court maintained the fiction of justice by executing the forms of justice, a charge, a hearing, a sentence, while ensuring that the substance of justice, actual accountability, and actual evidence never came anywhere near the proceedings. This is the architecture of royal power. The forms are maintained precisely to give the substance its cover. And if you have been watching and wondering which other supposedly civilized civilizations built their machinery of justice the same way, good.
That means the deconstruction is working. Like this video so more people can see what their textbooks hid from them. Now let's examine what happened after. The act of poisoning 1531 remained on the English statute books. It was used.
Margaret Davy, a servant woman convicted of poisoning multiple members of the household she served, was boiled alive under its provisions in 1542. She was described in contemporary accounts as a young woman, likely in her 20s. She was boiled at Smithfield, the same site as Roose.
The same apparatus, the same crowd, the same smell.
The act was eventually repealed in 1547, under the reign of Edward VI, Henry VIII's son, as part of a broader revision of the most extreme elements of Henrician law.
The repeal was framed as an act of mercy and enlightenment, a new reign establishing a more humane standard. Here is the temporal irony buried in that repeal. The repeal of the Boiling Act was presented as evidence of English civilization's capacity for self-correction, the legal system examining its excesses and reforming them.
And this is, in fact, how English legal history has largely treated the episode. A brief anomaly, an aberration in an otherwise upward trajectory toward humane governance. But the act was not an aberration. It was an entirely coherent product of the logic of Tudor power.
It did exactly what Tudor power always did. It used the machinery of law as a tool of royal will. draping the exercise of personal political violence in the legitimating garb of statute and parliamentary authority.
The aberration is not that it was passed. The aberration is that it was specific enough, a single named method of execution, directly traceable to a single specific incident, to be visible to later historians as a discrete act.
The broader pattern of using legal machinery to execute politically convenient targets without meaningful investigation continued under Edward VI, under Mary I, under Elizabeth I, under every subsequent English monarch for centuries.
The mechanism was refined, the individual steps more obscured, and the gap between the form of justice and its substance widened rather than narrowed.
The boiling cauldron at Smithfield is not a story about Tudor barbarism. It is a story about the relationship between law and power that is still playing out. Here is what the gap looks like clearly. Henry VIII is on your money. His face appears in countless cultural productions, dramatizations, novels, documentaries, as a complex, fascinating, larger-than-life historical figure.
The court he built is studied in universities as a center of Renaissance culture and humanist thought. Richard Roose has no face in the historical record. His name appears in legal documents and in a handful of contemporary chronicles. His guilt or innocence was never established. His connection to whoever may have actually been behind the poisoning was never investigated.
He was lowered into a cauldron of boiling water in front of thousands of people and cooked alive. And then he was repurposed, his execution converted into a law, his death industrialized into a precedent, his body transformed into a policy document.
The civilization that did this called itself the most sophisticated in Europe. The sophistication was real. The scholarship was real. The architecture of governance was real. And none of it had anything to do with what happened in the cauldron. The portrait and cauldron existed simultaneously, in the same kingdom, under the same king, in the same year. The portrait was the face the civilization showed to itself and to history. The cauldron was what the civilization actually was when it needed to be. Here is what we are really talking about when we talk about historical sanitization. It is not that historians lie.
It is that the selection of which details to include and which to exclude, which events to dwell on and which to pass over quickly, which individuals to name and which to leave nameless, that selection is never neutral.
It is always a choice, and the choice, consistently, across centuries of historical writing, has been to preserve the portrait. You now have the cauldron. The question the history books will never ask you is, how many cauldrons are behind the portraits you have not looked behind yet? If you want to keep pulling back the curtain on the history they sanitized, subscribe, turn on notifications, and drop a comment below. Which historical figure do you think has the biggest gap between their official portrait and the reality underneath? We may already be making that video. You cannot unknow what a cauldron at Smithfield actually meant. And that is exactly the point.